town of San Lorenzo, California, in the East Bay, across from San Francisco. And the place that I grew up in was what they call the vet village. In other words, it was a lot of prefabricated homes that were built basically in order to provide places to live for returning vets from World War II. So they called it a vet village. They also called San Lorenzo Levittown West, and I know you all know Levittown. But it was a place where houses were essentially built on an assembly line, and at the sort of peak of production, they were producing one home every 45 minutes. Looked at a little deeper, I can also see now in that moment that it was sort of the last spasm of urban industrial concentration of workers in particular that had begun really at the beginning of the 19th century. 100 years later, in the 1950s, the economy is still gathering people from the farms and clustering them around urban centers. And you think about the urbanization and the creation of cities in the early 19th century, and you think, well, that happened a long time ago. It had nothing to do with me. But I at least have been a direct, even though I didn't know it, a direct part of that history. I was probably part of the last generation that would be brought in from the farms before they were completely industrialized. So both of my parents were basically farm kids, one in Kansas, one in Oregon, and my mother in particular her father was simply a subsistence farmer. You know, they grew food to eat, they sold some of it, and that was basically it. So if things had stayed as they had in the past, I would have been essentially a peasant. I should have been a peasant. I am in certain ways still a peasant, but I don't want this to turn into a John Boehner moment where I start weeping about how difficult I had it growing up. So I'm just going to stop there. At any rate, this suburb, and this is a very I couldn't find my house online, but this is very typical. Can you see that at all, or do we need some lights different? Good enough? Yeah. There are these little 900 square foot houses, and each house was sort of the mirror image of the previous one. So you had two designs. You had sort of left design and right design, and they were just spread over, dozens of square miles. You know that story. So especially in the early 50s, these places were really unnatural places. Although we didn't know it, to us it seemed inevitable that doesn't everybody live in a place like this? Kids. There were no old people. There was no history. There were no old buildings at all. Everyone was more or less the same age. Every household seemed to have 3 kids. There were no rich people. There were no poor people. Everybody was white. There was no real connection to anything outside of the immediate burb other than going to a San Francisco Giants game, which always seemed to me like a completely surreal experience. When I was a kid, I used to cycle to the end of Hesperian Boulevard, and I would get to the end of it, and I would stop in fear, because what happened was there was just this blockade type thing, and on the other side of the blockade were these open fields, and in the distance an orchard or two. But to me, it felt like Renaissance discoverers going out to the end of the map and thinking that surely, the monsters and the dragons are just over there. The idea of anything beyond my little burb was terrifying to me. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing was, of course, the Cold War. In other words, Sputnik. This is how I experienced the Cold War. I didn't know anything more about it than that. But, you know, it's funny how you only remember one or two things about, you know, my entire first grade, for example. I don't remember anything about first grade except for two things. One thing was when I went to class and we'd sit down on our little carpets there and while the teacher read to us or whatever. And there was this kid in the class who would, well, I'm sitting back here, he's sitting up here. He would always turn around and look at me like this. He would go, like that. So he did that a lot. And it kind of caught my attention. And so the other thing that I remember is one day I came to class and the teachers were so excited. And that was in itself was strange. But overhead was this big satellite thing with this dog hanging out of it. And the teachers were so excited, they said, Sputnik, America's going to space. And suddenly they threw up these vast sort of cardboard mural spaces and said, let's paint the moon. And so all the yeah, and they all went over and they painted the moon, and I just kind of stood there like that, like this, going, what the hell? What the hell is going on? I have one other picture of that kind of captures that moment. This is actually a picture of, a photograph of me that I loaned to Larry McCaffrey when he wanted to do this anthology. He said, Kurt, do you have any photographs of yourself with a satellite we could use for this book? And I said, yeah, sure, Larry. I've got a lot of those, actually. And so I let him use this one. It's a very good anthology, by the way, but... the other side, the more, you know, another part that I didn't understand until it was all well done, was that what she was saying to me that day in pointing up to this Sputnik dog and painting the moon, she was saying, you're going to college. And, you know, yeah, the assumption that I was going to college was not something anybody from my social class had ever assumed before that moment. I don't think. The third thing, and Patrick alluded to this a bit too, the third thing that was a part of this story was the counterculture. Growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, that was a really big deal. I've often said when people talk to me about my upbringing, I've often said in a way that made no sense to them, I say I was raised by hippies. And here's the ocular proof. That's my mother and me sitting on her lap. I was raised by hippies. So the counterculture, as far as I was concerned, was very personal. It was walking into a record store for the first time and having this album by the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper, sort of jump out at you from among the Mel Torme and the Nat King Cole and Perry Como albums, right? And I had an experience, it was 1965 or so, some classmates of mine and I went to San Francisco to go to the DeYoung Museum. And so we were probably freshmen in college, freshmen in high school. And we're walking up the street. We were walking up Haight Street towards the park. And suddenly there was this guy walking towards us with long blonde hair and bell bottoms. And he was singing at the top of his lungs. And we froze in terror. I mean, basically, we were paralyzed with anxiety about what this guy was doing and what he might do to us. But he paid us no attention at all, just walked right by. And in some ways, you know, that was a moment where I might have seen my own future in that guy, but I didn't. But, you know, like a lot of other people in the Bay Area at that time, I listened to Big Brother and the Holding Company. Actually, I saw Big Brother and Janice at a college dance in Hayward where they were, I promise you, bored stiff. I lived in the Haight. I went to the Fillmore. I did all of those things. But what I got out of that was the idea that the world was ours to reinvent, or to invent in any way that we liked, which was an important kind of thing to learn. Although, you know, it didn't, I don't know that it ever occurred to me that the world wasn't ours to reinvent.